Australia, May 1901.
To the foundation of the Commonwealth, the Duke of York was sent by his father, Edward VII, King of Great Britain and the dominions beyond the seas. On May the 9th, Princess Mary, Duchess of York, with the Duke, who was to rule as King George V, left Government House, Melbourne. The first Governor-General of the Commonwealth had sworn in the first cabinet in January. The Parliament was elected in March by the votes of Australian men and women. It was a loyal and devoted country. The people of Melbourne cheered for the nation as the King's son drove through the streets. At the exhibition building, the Duke spoke for his father. I now, in his name and on his behalf, declare this Parliament open. Parliament House, Melbourne, was the centre of the new Commonwealth.
At last, the nation was united. We were no longer just South Australians or Queenslanders, Victorians or Westralians, New South Welshmen or Tasmanians. We were Australians. The cities were busy, buying, selling, making, building. Half of the country's 3 million crowded into the state capitals, outlets for the huge country beyond. Out back was the never-never country, with 10, 20, 100 miles between homesteads. Through the broken inland, the teamster cursed his horses across the gullies, making his road as he went. But the engineers were pushing rails further out from the ports, joining the bush with the cities. On the limits of cultivation, axes bit deeper. We tore the timber and the grass away to make room for crops and stock. We built weirs and pipelines to bring life to the dry country. The coastline ran 12,000 miles, with perhaps a dozen ports of any size. Ships could sail into sheltered bays unwatched. The coast was long, open to attack.
The coast was open to attack, and to guard it there was a handful of soldiers. In 1909, the government invited the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lord Kitchener, to advise on Australia's defence. He studied the problems and saw the men. In 1910, the government acted on Kitchener's recommendation. There was a national plan for defence, and none too soon.
Wars. We weren't worried about wars. Too much fun and games at home. On Saturdays, we went to the football, with acid drops all round, and all for 2 shillings.
We had class without distinction.
Gee, Henley on the Yarra. I'm glad I wore my voile. And look at Lily with that same old pink parasol.
Jobs were harder then, I suppose, but it was a pretty good life. The new arbitration court had just given us a living wage. £2.8 it was.
But you could get a pound of steak for 2p.
And a tram ride cost a penny. So did a newspaper, where we read stories like that one in March 1913.
Today, the site of the federal capital will be named. The city which will be the centre of all that is best and finest in the national life.
Not all the newspapers of the day agreed with this.
The capital in the bush is a folly the Commonwealth will regret. It is a city initiated in a lot of mummery and make-believe.
Black-bearded Mr. King O'Malley, the Minister for Home Affairs, stood indeed like a king as he represented the Commonwealth with the Prime Minister, Mr. Andrew Fisher, in top hat and frock coat. The Governor-General, Lord Denman, laid the foundation stone of the national capital. From the telegraphic tent, the thousands of words of the speeches were flashed across the wires. At midday, Lady Denman spoke. I named the capital of the Commonwealth, Canberra. The Attorney General, Mr. William Modis Hughes, was cheerfully optimistic about the city to be built in the open spaces of New South Wales.
An area of 900 square miles had become Commonwealth territory. Canberra was to stand for the nation.
The open spaces and the long coast demanded more attention now. Cables from overseas carried stories of the danger of war. In 1913, the Royal Australian Navy assembled for the first time in Sydney Harbour. In the following year, Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson arrived, the Governor-General who was to hold office through the war.
War still didn't mean much to us. That was all on the other side of the world. 6 weeks away, they said. And we were doing pretty well. Plenty of jobs, more people than ever settling in the country, a lot of stuff being produced, good prices.
And then war started. Australia came in with England, of course. But it'd all be over, we said, before our boys got there.
Remember that, Digger? Remember the desert? Leaving Cairo, Lawazza? We were having a bonza time, waiting for this.
1915, April the 25th, dawn, Gallipoli.
Remember, Dig? Shrapnel, rifle fire, dig and crouch, duck and jump, watch old Johnny Turk. In the end, we had to go. We left 8,000 cobbers and a name, Anzac.
With Gallipoli, the war came nearer. Industry changed to meet the demands of a fighting empire. In 1915, the Australian cruiser Brisbane ran down the slips at Cockatoo Island. New industries rose. Steel for shells and guns, for ships and rails. Retorts were built at Newcastle. Safe from attack, Australia could get on with work.
Remember, Light Horse? Riding your whalers through the sand and dust after the Turk, giving him better than he gave us at Anzac, attacking through Palestine with Harry Chauvel leading the show under Allenby. While you were fighting to Damascus, we got to France. We got to know France really well, down in the mud, and we got to know the Boche really well too, fighting. That was 1916, when things were tough, but we knew the people back home were thinking of us when Billy Hughes turned up at the front.
In 1916, the Prime Minister returned to Australia. He had seen the fighting fronts. The Prime Minister argued for conscription. Australia needed more soldiers. By referendum in 1916 and 1917, the people rejected the proposals. Recruiting was intensified. There were campaigns in every city. Men were needed, and so was money.
Fire button, sir.
1918, and we were still in France, and the King came out and gave the boss his KCB, General Sir John Monash now. But a Sir didn't stop the German shells. They kept on coming. It looked as if we'd end up with long beards trailing in the Flanders mud. And then, right out of the blue, the Germans crashed.
November the 11th, 1918.
Battered and tired, we were going home. Kaiser Bill had no more use for those big guns. We tossed it in. Remember the end of it, Digger? The victory parades in London with the New Zealanders, the Tommies, the Yanks and the French. Back in Australia, the last parades were strictly informal. Now we could tell the Sergeant Major. We got out of uniform just as quick as we could, into civvy suits we bought with our deferred pay. We rushed into peace.
Welcomed to Australia in 1920, the Prince of Wales saw the beginning of our post-war expansion.
The attack on the land began again. British and Australian soldier settlers tried their luck with the new crops.
Get that camera out of the way. We're busy.
We got a harvest. There were markets all over the world. All we had to do, we thought, was produce and sell. Industry had come to stay, developed by war and protected by tariffs. Endless coal trains crawled across the country, carrying power. Steel now was for machines, for factories and farms. Electricity was generated in thousands of kilowatts to drive 1 million machines. Goods we once had imported, we made ourselves.
Wherever you trade, buy Australian made.
What we needed, we were going to make. We tried our hands at trades new to us, trades demanded by new conditions. Our steel and cement, timber and glass went into the buildings that climbed up from the city streets. Motor cars puffed and spluttered, marking the start of another change, with their need for longer, better roads and quicker movement. In Sydney, hundreds of thousands of people crossed the harbour in ferries morning and night. Cars crowded into slow-moving punts. In 1923, work began on the bridge. An arch of steel grew from both sides of the harbour. In 1930, the arms that were to hold the decking met. Chief designer John Bradfield checked the locking of the arch. The plan for the Hume Weir was a national model. The governments of the Commonwealth, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia attacked the vital problem of water. Work began in 1919 on the weir for irrigation in the valley of the country's biggest river, the Murray. The Federal Council for Scientific and Industrial Research attacked the pest prickly pear that covered in the northeast an area larger than England. Scientists experimented for years before they found, in America, an insect to destroy the cactus, Cactoblastis. Science was industry's partner. On freed land, crops and pastures grew again. But science was to change the Australian scene even more.
In 1919, a warplane climbed into the English sky. Australian Flying Corps officers Ross and Keith Smith flew from England to Australia in 29 days.
A stunt. That's all it is. Useless.
In 1924, a seaplane flew round Australia. Wing Commander Stanley Goebel and Lieutenant Ivor McIntyre covered 8,000 miles of a shrinking country in 44 days.
Flying? Waste of time and money.
In 1928, a tiny plane came from London.
Hinkle, Hinkle, little star, 16 days, and here you are.
What's the good of it all? That's what I want to know.
Flying alone in a single-engine plane, Bert Hinkler made a new record for the England-Australia flight. In the same year, a 3-engined Fokker monoplane drew a line across the Pacific. The Southern Cross flew from California to Australia in 83.5 flying hours instead of the ship's 3 weeks. Public interest in flying was growing fast. The world came nearer. Australia welcomed Charles Kingsford Smith with Charles Alm and Americans Harry Lyon and Jim Warner.
I still don't see what good it's all going to do.
But already the stunts had proved their use. Australia was growing smaller. From the early 20s, commercial airlines had been operating. Australia needed aviation, and it was a country made for flying. Long distances, low mountains, good flying weather. Fast and direct travel in straight lines suited us. We had a new angle on our country, a new answer to old problems of peace and war.
Royal Australian Air Force planes flying over Canberra marked another federal achievement. In 1927, exactly 26 years after the opening of the first federal parliament in Melbourne, the son of King George V opened the first parliament in Canberra. Dame Nellie Melba sang the national anthem as the Duke of York looked over the city that had been called a bush capital. The Prime Minister, Stanley Melbourne Bruce, escorted the Duke to the door that was to open on a new chapter of Australian nationalism. In the House of Representatives was to stand a Speaker's chair, exactly like that in the House of Commons in London, a gift from the Parliament of Great Britain. In the Senate chamber, a king's son read a king's message. I share in their pride in the new capital city and join in the prayers for its successful future.
The duties of the federal government reach beyond Australia's shores. Papua had been taken over in the first years of federation. In 1920, responsibility for German New Guinea passed to Australia under a mandate from the League of Nations. Australian control brought some of the necessities of civilization to the natives. In the plans of the administration, their welfare continues to be dominant. From the tropics to the South Pole, Australia's interests extend. Shackleton had been in Antarctica in 1905. In 1929, Douglas Mawson sailed there for the federal government to explore a country whose resources were hardly guessed. Along an arc of 2,000 miles of the frozen coast, Mawson claimed, in the name of King George V, lands that were to make up Australian Antarctica.
The 20s were a time of national consolidation and international recognition. In 1924, crowds went to Sydney Harbour to welcome men of the Royal Navy that had escorted so many Australians to the battlefields of the First World War. British sailors and Marines marched through the streets of Sydney. It was a British recognition of the growing Australian nation. In 1925, an American fleet followed the British. Once again, it was a national recognition.
And a personal recognition. They were wonderful days, the 20s. Everything you needed, you could get. I remember at home our husbands used to talk about men, money and markets. Trade, communications, speed, all that sort of thing. But when you were out...
The men didn't always talk about money and markets. We did get away from the office for the test match. Gregory bowling them fast in the 20s. Maley tricking them with googlies. But our bowlers didn't always trick Hobbs or Sutcliffe. The old-timers watched from the stand. Tommy Garrett, Jack Blackham, Warwick Armstrong. And in 28, there was an up-and-coming young bat, Don Bradman. There was a new entertainment offering, talkies.
I have traveled in other lands and received many welcomes. No welcome cheers me more than the welcome, a good Australian welcome, from my own people of my native country.
James Scullin returned from Great Britain to face a crisis. In 1929, the end of the boom had come. Export prices fell. The abundant loan money of the 20s dried up. We heard an ominous word: depression.
Even the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge reflected the unrest of the day, as the unknown Francis de Groot raced the State Premier John Lang to the formal ribbon.
We had plenty to sell, but world markets were hard to reach. The Ottawa Agreement of 1932 helped for a time. Trade treaties made some sales possible. But only slowly did Australia begin to climb out of the depression. And all the time, the world was coming closer. In 1934, Charles Scott and Campbell Black won the Melbourne Centenary Air Race, surprising even themselves.
Actually, true, I wouldn't know that I was here. Only somebody gave me a paper and I see that my name is in it.
London to Melbourne in 2 days, 23 hours.
That year, from Queensland, the Duke of Gloucester dispatched the planes of a regular overseas air service. Pilot Lester Brain took off on the first flight. There was a weekly air service to England. 12 days to London. As the world came nearer, Australia's responsibilities grew. By the Statute of Westminster in 1931, King George V became King of Australia, now a self-governing country. The nation's problems were the care of the Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons.
We live in troubled times. Everyone prays that peaceful councils may prevail amongst the nations. But we realise also that the greatest hope for world peace lies in a united and strong British Commonwealth of Nations.
Tests of our strength were coming.
1931. Japan, our near neighbour, with growing military strength, left the League of Nations. 1935. Italy attacked Abyssinia. The patterns of a new war were evident. The strain was too much for Joseph Lyons. In 1939, the Prime Minister died. Robert Gordon Menzies became Prime Minister to face the task of declaring war.
We can't be beaten.
There was swift action. Unanimously, Parliament endorsed the declaration. Australia was at war.
By January of 1940, the 6th Division was training Egypt. Another force was diverted to stand guard in England, where German attack threatened. January of 1941 saw the first Libyan campaign. The 6th Division fought with British formations, rolling up the Italians in an advance which swept on to Tobruk. And after Tobruk, Derna and Benghazi. Then Greece. General Blamey led the Anzac Corps, and the 6th Division was there, taking up positions towards the Yugoslav border. And then came the weight of the German attack. Some Australians escaped to Crete to meet the first large airborne invasion in the history of war. The Royal Navy carried most back to Alexandria, wounded, exhausted, but prepared to fight on. In the desert, Rommel's Afrika Korps struck back. But the Germans were held on the Tobruk perimeter, where the 9th Division stood. Royal Australian Air Force men flew in support of the ground troops, while in other theatres of war, RAAF planes of all types, fighters and bombers, reconnaissance and transport, flew over the Middle East, England, Europe, and the oceans of the world. Australians signed their honour in another campaign. In Syria, the 7th Division, with elements of the 6th, fought their way to victory. From the desert to the snow, fighting. Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, Prime Minister John Curtin said, The war with Japan is not a phase of the struggle with the Axis powers, but is a new war. From December, the 8th Division fought in the British forces in Malaya, but Japanese jungle tactics drove them back until they reached bombed and helpless Singapore. Then surrender. 16,000 Australians were taken prisoner. In February, an enemy struck for the first time at Australian soil. The Japanese bombed Darwin.
We had a new enemy and a new ally. American troops came to Australia, and the battle-hardened veterans of the 6th and 7th Divisions returned to defend their own country. We were all at war. Men were in the AIF, the garrisons, the militia. Others fought with their hands and skills building aerodromes, roads, docks in the Civil Constructional Corps. Women worked in the services, the land army, and behind factory benches. Australia was a forward base. Food and petrol were needed for war. We had to use substitutes. We got to know what identification cards and ration books were. Luxuries were in short supply. War had come home.
On the country's doorstep, the Japanese smashed at New Guinea. Australian troops of the 39th Militia Battalion fought back stubbornly along the Kokoda Trail. Then came veteran AIF reinforcements. The Japanese advance was halted. Supply, the hardest problem of the campaign, was finally solved by air. The biscuit bombers speeded the advance. The weight of the American armed forces was thrown into the battle. The American Pacific Fleet with the Royal Australian Navy struck at Japanese supply lines. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway secured Allied command of Southwest Pacific waters. The air attack that was called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea broke up Japanese plans for reinforcing troops. The drive lost force. The full force of the Allied attack was mounted for the first time against Lae and New Guinea. With United States paratroops, men of the 7th Division dropped on Anzac. Returned from the victory of El Alamein, the 9th Division, covered by US Navy and Air Force, landed on the beaches. The Japanese retreated. The Australians fought after them. Island hopping became the pattern of Pacific advance. May the 8th brought the end of the war in Europe, but the Allied forces carried on towards Japan. Victory was near. The victory that John Curtin did not live to see.
August the 15th, 1945. The war was over. We made our way back to a peacetime world, different from the world we'd left forever in 1939. Joseph Benedict Chifley was the Prime Minister of a nation returning to peace. Servicemen and women became civilians again, sometimes with difficulty. We set out to restore peacetime production. We needed many things we'd done without, the little luxuries and the great necessities. Men and women from war-battered Europe came here in hundreds of thousands under Australia's migration schemes. We knew now that Australia was part of the world, not an isolated island.
For mutual defense in the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand had signed the Anzac Pact in 1944. In 1946, Norman Makin became the first president of the Security Council of the United Nations.
From Canberra, the Australian government watches a world of change and tension. After the elections of 1949 and 1951, Robert Gordon Menzies again became leader of the government, Prime Minister of Australia in Jubilee year. From the King's Hall in Parliament House, Canberra, he delivers the Jubilee message.
The Commonwealth Jubilee ceremonies show forth our just pride in the growth and achievements of 50 years of Australian nationhood. They evoke memories, but they do much more than this. They also fire us with courage and resolution for the future. There are immense tasks ahead. Their performance will demand from us who are now living a large measure of devotion and a clear spirit of service. The past is our inheritance. The future is our responsibility.